Yes. Okay. So if you have been here at our Friday nights throughout the semester, you might recall that we have been doing this series called "Does Jesus Care About Blank?" You might also know that if you've just seen any of the many signs that have been on campus and vandalized and stolen that say, "Does Jesus care about blank?" Yes, Jesus cares about blank. And in this sermon series, we've just been looking at all of these topics that consume a lot of our attention, that affect our lives on a day-to-day basis, and just trying to take a step back and see, well, what does Jesus say about this thing? What does Jesus say about politics? What does Jesus have to say about dating? Stuff like that. How does what he taught us affect how we live? And I got tasked with the wonderful topic of sexuality, which is so great because just like everyone agrees on it. There's no sensitivity. There's no pain around sexuality. So this should be pretty easy. I'm just kidding. Don't worry, there will be no diagrams in my slides. So I believe at its core, sexuality is about the way that we relate to our own bodies and the purpose of them, and to the bodies of others. And what we think about biblical sexuality says a lot about what we think about God and just what he's like in general. But before we dive into teaching, I just want to acknowledge a little bit that all of us experience brokenness as it relates to our sexuality. We all experience pain. We have all been on the receiving end of pain, and we've all contributed to pain when it comes to sexuality because we live in a broken world. But part of living in a broken world means that we have not all experienced the same amount of pain and the same amount of brokenness in this. Because a broken world is not a fair one. This isn't a world that God has come back and set right fully yet. And while I believe that he's actively healing, I also believe that there are all sorts of experiences in this room right now of just unspeakable pain when it comes to this. And that we're not all coming from the same place. And this unfairness and brokenness applies to all aspects of life. It applies to money, it applies to intellect, it applies to health, it applies to family, all of these things. And while I consider myself blessed, I have just kind of firsthand just seen the immeasurable pain that trying to make sense of our sexuality in a broken world brings. For the next minute or two, I'll be telling you about some people's stories that I've heard. They won't be very graphic, but I just want you to know that that's what's coming. I've sat across from a very close friend who struggled with pornography for so long and to such an extent that they were actually researching having themselves chemically castrated. I'm close friends with a celibate gay man who first came out to his best friend when he was in college, only for his best friend to feed into his fears of condemnation and rejection by ghosting him for months. I've known more people than I ever imagined I would who have had their sexual innocence stripped from them by family members, friends, strangers, and I've seen them take that and put the blame back on themselves and the shame that comes from that. I've known multiple students who are asexual or aromantic, so they don't know what to do with a talk like this because they're like, sexuality seems to be like a part of everyone, and I keep hearing human beings are sexual creatures, and that's not part of my life, so what do I do with that? Where do I fit into this? I've known countless people who lived sexually promiscuous lives in high school and college, and then later found it difficult when they got married not to compare their spouse to their previous sexual partners. I've known people who are transgender who have chosen not to transition at all, but are kind of filled with turmoil. I've known people who simply dress differently and use a different name, people who take hormones. I've got a friend who has bottom surgery scheduled, and I've seen them go through trying to think through that. I've known people with all sorts of abnormal sexual desires that they don't know what to do with, that take them well into their 20s to ever tell a single person about because they think that they're the only person who's different in any way. I've known people who started watching porn at a young age and wanted to see stuff that had people their age in it, and so they watched content that had children in it. And then I talked to them well into college, and they're struggling with the shame of that, of feeding into an exploitative system. I know a guy who was so down bad that he subscribed to his cousin's OnlyFans for a while. That's a little weird, but he unsubscribed, so that's good. While I consider myself fortunate in terms of the pain that I've gotten to avoid, I do remember being in high school, growing up around purity culture, and being so ashamed by my own lust that I would stand in the mirror and just try to bruise myself, thinking that maybe I could physically punish myself into not being a lustful person anymore. Carrying that shame all the while being told by mentors and parents friends, friends of parents, who would just say, "I'm so glad that you don't watch pornography. I'm so glad." And just the whole time being like, "I suppose I'm the only person in the world who does this," right? This brokenness affects us all in so many ways. While I don't want to have to do this, I think I need to start in order to clear way for us to hear the core truths of what God has to say. We need to acknowledge what are the lies that are floating around. Because like any important thing that Jesus cares about, I don't think the enemy wants us to hear what Jesus has to say about this. I don't think he wants us to believe what God says about this, right? And so first we need to clear the air of these kind of untruthful things that are floating around. And you see Jesus and Paul do this all the time. You see Jesus a lot of times when he teaches, he says, "You have heard it said, blah, 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 but I say to you, blah, blah, blah." Right? Or you see Paul throughout his ministry kind of call out lies that have been puppeted, both from the secular and the religious world, right? So in Corinthians, he talks about how they say, the body is for food and food for the body, essentially saying the body doesn't matter, and he calls that out. He also calls out religious lies in Galatians, the lies of people who claim that you needed to be circumcised to be saved. All of that kind of thing. There are so many strongholds of lies that we're surrounded by. It's almost as if there are two massive storm clouds hovering above us, blotting out the light of who God is and what he has to say about this. And let's affectionately call these storm clouds the sexual revolution and purity culture. And I'm going to describe these two forces to you, and as I describe their ideologies and their effects on people, I want you to pause and think, okay, where have I seen this? Where have I heard this? Where have I believed these things? So to start off with, purity culture says, at all costs, the heart is deceitful, ignore your heart, follow the rules. These are the rules, blankety blank, your skirt cannot be more than 4 finger breadths above your knee. If it is, you've caused someone to stumble and should be ashamed. And it's your fault that people are that kind of thing. Ignore your heart, follow the rules, and it's because I said so. Whereas the sexual revolution completely flips that. It says, ignore the rules, follow your heart, because you said so, right? Like you take control of your own life and do what you want with your body. Purity culture, obviously, believes purity above all. Like I have to have not a hint of sexual immorality. They would say that, right? And then you've got songs like "Gimme That Christian Side Hug" about how Christians could not possibly hug someone straight on without, I guess, lusting, which, that's kind of wild. And then the sexual revolution emphasizes pleasure above all and self-fulfillment above all. Now, the purity culture focuses on my need to create my own goodness. And we'll get more into that in a sec. But I have to create my own goodness. And I have to be good. And the sexual revolution says I need to create my own meaning. Because the sexual revolution came out of this kind of atheistic worldview that says that there's no intent, there's no meaning that we're inheriting just by belonging to God and belonging to each other. And so I get to create my own meaning. I get to create my own purpose in life. Purity culture is fueled by shame. I had a friend who was not really a Christian growing up, but kind of would be brought occasionally by their mother, mostly because their mother was guilty for not raising them in the church. She would occasionally drop her off at like a weekend church camp or something like that. And at one of these church camps, my friend, who at the time was living a sexually active lifestyle, they passed around a rose, and you might have seen this before. They passed around a rose and had everyone kind of pass it down, pass it down, pass it down. And after everyone had touched it and it got back to the stage, they held it up and they said, everyone's touched this rose. Who wants this rose? Which Jesus, Jesus wants it, right? But they act like there's there's this unredeemable damage that we've done to ourselves, and that we are essentially surrendering our own value and worth if we have sinned in this area, right? And they use shame to do that, right? It's the same thing with, I'm so glad that you have never watched porn, rather than asking, hey, I know 90% of men your age do this, like, have you? Sexual revolution is fueled by self-actualization, right? It's the opposite. So while purity culture thinks we can live a better life by pushing ourselves down, the sexual revolution thinks we can live a good life by lifting ourselves up at all costs, right? There's a reason that a lot of pop songs about sex tend to compare it to a religious experience. You'll believe God is a woman. You know what I mean? Like, there's a reason for that, because we're trying to lift ourselves up through these escapades that we're engaging in under the guise of the sexual revolution. Purity culture believes that at its core, the body is dangerous. And so, because it's the source of all of these urges, and the desire is to kind of unplug myself from the body and be spiritually perfect. But the sexual revolution also doesn't have an awesome view of the body, because it believes that the body is meaningless. And there are bioethicists, and there are feminists, and there are just voices in the community that support the sexual revolution that still say, my body says it's unnatural for me to do blank, but who cares what the body has to say? I care what I have to say, right? Believes that the body is meaningless. And then there's kind of a difficulty here, because on one hand, with the purity culture, you're never clean enough. And there's all sorts of people who grew up in that environment who just doubt their own salvation constantly. I found myself doing that. I found myself doubting my salvation because I struggle with the same things over and over again. But within the sexual revolution, you're never fulfilled enough. And you can talk to people. There's a reason that people who, for instance, become addicted to pornography, they end up getting into more and more fringe and hardcore kinds of things, right? Because when you make the metric for success your own thrill, the thing that thrilled you last time or made you feel seen and worthy last time probably won't be enough to do it again. But what's amazing is that there's actually quite a few things that purity culture and the sexual revolution have in common. Because on one hand, they're opposites, but on the other hand, they're two sides of the same coin. First of all, they're both preoccupied with me. They're not looking at what kind of value has God given this. How is God working to make this better? How is the Spirit working? They're just saying either how can I get as much pleasure and meaning out of this that I give to it, or how can I earn my own salvation? How can I clean myself up, right? But it all comes back around to what I do, and I believe fails because of that. Because they're both focused on me, they both will never satisfy. That's what we were saying. I'll never be good or clean enough, but I'll also be never fulfilled enough. Because humans are not equipped to make something good and glorious out of our bodies if we believe that our bodies are just this dangerous burden or a blank slate. Like, we don't have the capability to take something like that and make something awesome out of it. They both have a low view of the body. Purity culture views it as dangerous and bad, largely because the grandparents, in terms of thought of the purity culture, are Hellenism and Gnosticism and fundamentalism. And if you don't know what I mean by that, that's okay. And the grandparents of the sexual revolution that makes them believe that the body is meaningless are, in a lot of ways, Darwin and Nietzsche, right? My body is just like a big old bag of meat, and I can do with it what I want. When I say that, I'm actually quoting people like Richard Dawkins and Peter Singer and stuff like that. That's not my quote. They refer to the body as essentially a sack of meat. And then finally, these two schools of thought are both reactionary. And you've probably seen this. The best way to make someone who's a proponent of the sexual revolution speak up and say something foul is to put someone who supports purity culture in the room next to them. You can see this, for instance, when there's someone on campus with a sign that says, like, these people are going to hell, and it's homosexuals and masturbators, they're going to hell. This happened at the Plinth recently. And what ended up happening is that a bunch of people started jumping in front of them and then coming out and then talking about their sexual escapades. Because these two things are just reacting to each other. And they're built on fear and a desire for control. And neither of them is actually willing to slow down and look to God for the answers. So, on top of all of that, the results are in for both of these things. They have both shown that they have failed. Sexual revolution, it's built on happiness. The metric for it is my own fulfillment, my own freedom, and people aren't happy. There's a negative correlation between the number of premarital sexual partners and your satisfaction in your sex life, both in general and in marriage, which has been found and confirmed by numerous studies. Promiscuity before marriage increases the likelihood of cheating within marriage, which leads to the dissolution of families. There's a positive correlation between sexual promiscuity and mental health issues, especially when taken to the extreme. Obviously, there's so many studies on pornography that it rewires the brain to struggle with intimacy, lowers sexual satisfaction in marriage, often is an escalating behavior, contributes to unhealthy cycles of stress, loneliness, fuels sex trafficking, profits from non-consensual content and abuse, promotes sexual violence, and more. And again, so many studies. A lot of them are from people who in general are not Christians and don't think pornography is in and of itself bad, but you still have people like Rashida Jones, right, who is not a Christian, thinks porn in and of itself is fine, and still wants reform in this area because she sees how problematic it becomes. And of course, with the sexual revolution as Christians, I think we have to have huge problems with it because it comes from a humanist, atheist mindset, right? That says, again, like, my body is mine to do with as I please because it did not come from a designer who has intent for it. Brandon had this analogy that if we don't pay attention to what we were designed for, it's like trying to haul gravel with my Prius. Right? It's like, oh, I can make my body do blink. Like, I can do that, right? But it's like, is that what it was meant for? Right? Like, I could go haul 2 tons of sand with my Prius. It would take a lot of time, and it would probably never quite be the same ever again. And I would probably get a lot of looks. But then I would just switch, and I would use my wife's Prius, and I would drive that because we're a Prius family. That part of the analogy breaks down. Don't try to make that make sense. But again, we have to look to the designer to see what he wants. More on that in a sec. And that's all those issues with the sexual revolution are to say nothing of the health risks. Which I don't bring those up to bring shame on anyone who might have experienced that, but that's the reality of this situation. But purity culture does not have a great record either. You've got huge, poster child people within purity culture who have totally failed, right? So the author of I Kiss Dating Goodbye, which a book that my family read, we supported this idea of don't go on dates, you need to court, dating should be done through the family, and it was all tied into the purity culture. And this guy apologized publicly for writing this book because of the amount of pain that this caused people. The show 19 Kids and Counting, the Duggars, man. It was about this family that had a bunch of kids, and they were, Christian celebrities, and they would not hold hands until engagement or kiss until marriage, and they had this squeaky clean view. And then it comes out that one of the older brothers had assaulted or molested his sisters, and that the family had tried to handle it in their own way, discounting therapy and stuff like that, and essentially sent him to a place that also viewed things through the lens of purity culture and tried to blame his sisters for what happened to them. And because of that, the issues in this man's heart were able to fester for a long time, and he's in jail for other sexual crimes. And this family was the poster children for purity culture. I have had a friend who grew up in this culture as well, who his parents caught him watching something that he wasn't supposed to be, and so they put a verse that was connecting lust to condemnation on the ceiling so he would see it when he was going to bed. Just beating him over the head with shame tactics. And he still has panic attacks around intimacy. I had a professor at Collin College who, he's a little older, and he, on his wedding night, they get to the hotel room, and his wife just breaks down crying, and he's like, "What?" She's like, "I don't know what to do." This man had to give his wife the talk on their wedding night because she grew up in a subculture that was so afraid of sex and thought the body was such a gross, ugly thing, and so he ended up having to do that. That's weird. I'm going to tie my shoe real quick. Let y'all just stew in that for a sec. Can you imagine? And then it's like you give them the talk, and then are you like, you ready? Or do you give it a day? I don't really know. They figured it out. They have kids. Anyways, but yeah, so there's all those things, and then there are stories of people who have taken their own lives, or at least contemplated it, because of the shame tactics that this kind of thing employs. And it can really mess you up. I genuinely, I'm going to say this again, I doubted my salvation for years because of my struggles with lust. And there are journal entries I have that are written in all caps where I'm calling myself a pervert, hoping that will make things change. There's also a journal entry that says, God, it's from 2012, and I've changed it a lot, but it says, God, please elect Mitt Romney and help me to never masturbate again. And as Steon pointed out, neither of those prayers were answered. All right, so we've pointed out that a lot of these things don't work well, and that kind of leaves us like, what? What do I do? Yeah, you can see the mess that we've made as a culture, both the church and outside the church. And we both like to point and say, well, you're worse. And it's like both sides have people killing themselves, if I'm going to be blunt. And both sides have people hating their lives, and both sides are failing. And both sides, in a lot of ways, are not actually leading people closer to God. So what does Scripture say about our bodies and our sexuality? In other ways, if we can dispel these clouds, if we can dispel these things that are floating around and actually hear what God has to say. Like Kylie was saying when she was talking about dating a few weeks ago, she quoted Romans 12 that says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, for this is your act of spiritual worship. Don't conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." And you can hear from that, one, that God is merciful, and that's where we start from, unlike in purity culture. But then two, unlike in the sexual revolution, we offer our bodies up completely as living sacrifices to God. And then three, that God has a good, pleasing, and perfect will, and we're supposed to find out what that is. But for some reason, we can't find that out unless we offer ourselves up as sacrifices. It's a thing we find out by living. So let's go back to Genesis and see, okay, well, what is God's good, pleasing, and perfect will? Caroline was reading in Genesis 1, it says, God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over every living creature that moves on the ground. So what can we see about God's good, pleasing, and perfect will? What does he say about our bodies and about sex? One, the body is good. Our bodies are good. Although they are affected by brokenness in so many countless ways, our bodies are inherently good. And the first reason for that is that we're made in God's image. And I think now, because we were kind of brought up under like a Western Hellenistic view of things, we think, yeah, we're made in God's image, but really that's because of our intellect. You know what I mean? Or like, really that's because of our creativity. And it's like, I think those things are part of it, but the body is the one thing that every image bearer has in common, right? You could point to intellect or creativity, and there are people that, because of a broken world we live in, are not able to share in those blessings, but they still have a body, and those people are made in God's image because they have a body. Again, the idea that the body is bad while the spirit is good is not a Christian idea. And some of you, if you know your Bibles, might be thinking about Paul saying, like, I discipline my body, I make it my slave, this. Usually, that comes from the Greek word sarx, which just sounds like a Scottish person saying sucks. But that's the word for the flesh, which is when they talk about essentially like us being bound to sin, our sinful nature. But there's another word for body, which is soma, right? So a lot of times we hear flesh and we think, oh, the fact that I'm a physical being is bad. No, the fact that I'm a sinner is bad. We get so focused on the brokenness of our bodies that we experience that I just don't think that we're grateful to God for giving us a good body, right? When was the last time you were grateful for your senses? And when was the last time you were grateful for the connection to creation that God gave you? Our bodies are so good, apparently, that God chose them to be the temple of his Spirit, which is wild to think of. Like, if you don't think that's crazy, go back and read Exodus and read how the tabernacle was built and how many just precious materials were used in the making of that. And then think about the fact that Jesus essentially considers our bodies to be the pinnacle of where he wants to live. Christianity is unique in its positive view of embodiment. Our bodies are not meaningless, as atheists say, but we're also not so dirty that God would never want to walk among us, as a Muslim might say. Our bodies are affected by the fall, but they're good. And in the new heavens and earth, the solution is not us getting rid of our bodies, it's us having redeemed, resurrected ones. Number two, although it's affected by brokenness, sex is good. Nice. Cool. The first command that God gives to humanity is be fruitful and multiply. That's the first one. He's like, sweet, y'all are here, y'all are image bearers, now then, be fruitful and multiply, right? Like, God loves that. There's sex all over creation. He commands the animals to be fruitful and multiply. If you have plant allergies, you're probably allergic to plants being fruitful and multiplying, right? That's pollen. That's kind of crazy. And I think in a lot of ways, sex can be a microcosm of the kind of connection and self-giving that you see in God's nature. That God is triune and that he is self-giving. I think God's vision for sex is an expression of who he is in a lot of ways. And it's meant to express the connectedness that he wants for us. And you don't see in the New Testament a departure from this. Like you see Paul in 1 Corinthians, he says, this is the same book where or the same letter where he's like, y'all, like, stop being so perverted all the time. Like a chapter after that, he says, do not deprive each other. He's talking to married couples. Do not deprive each other of sex, except by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. So Paul, the same Paul who's like sexual sin is like uniquely dangerous. The next chapter of this letter, he's like, keep having sex, married couples, right? Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge that we're all affected by the brokenness that affects sex. I think a lot of times the church, I need to drink water. I said the church. A lot of times the church focuses on unique kinds of brokenness or kinds of difference. But heterosexual promiscuousness and selfishness have ruined way more families than homosexuality ever has, right? So, because heterosexuality by nature means I'm attracted to women, plural, which is different from marriage, right? So that brokenness that we experience affects all of us. Next, although they're affected by brokenness, our gender differences are good. Y'all don't want to hear that. So Genesis 2:18, Adam's alone with the animals in the garden, and God says, it's not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him. Now, even within this verse, we feel the brokenness because we're like, that sounds like the patriarchy to me, or I hate when people say that sounds like the patriarchy to me, depending on, whether you're traditional or progressive in that. I think it helps to look at what did the Jews actually make of this? What does that Hebrew word actually mean? In the image there is someone to help against me, which sounds weird, someone to help against the man. But the idea is it's not good for him to be alone. He needs someone to balance him out, right? So the rabbis would use the image of two planks of wood or two columns leaning on each other. And it's the idea that they're actually different that's giving them that stability, which is pretty cool. Yeah, and I think, all of these gifts, so the body, sex, our gender differences, are good things given to us from God. And it seems like the nature of living in a broken world is that the best gifts that we've received are also the ones that in their brokenness cause the most pain, right? So family is such a good gift, and then brokenness in family causes so much pain, right? Technology and the ability to be creative is such a good gift, but you can look at just the 20th century and all of the horrible atrocities that happened in that century alone, and you look at, brokenness paired with technology or brokenness paired with creativity can cause a lot of pain, right? And so I think in some ways the amount of pain we feel in regards to the body and sex doesn't show that it's bad, it shows how good it was meant to be. You know what I mean? It shows how good of a plan God has for those things, and we can kind of feel that in ourselves. And I think because of that, because of the brokenness and the pain, God has to move to protect us and keep us from hurting each other too much with that brokenness, right? Because you see, Genesis 2, that happens. Genesis 3, the fall happens, and immediately the dynamic between men and women, God warns them that that's going to get a lot more painful. And then in Genesis 4 through 6, you've got men essentially just taking whichever wife they want. You've got polygamy, you've got all of these things. And it's no coincidence that the fall immediately leads to this sexual perversion. So there's a reason that God moves to bring protection and help restore the goodness to sexuality through things like marital covenants and things like that. So finally, although they are misused and misinterpreted, the commands of God are good. Because again, we start out with our bodies, and God blesses our bodies. He blesses our sexuality. He blesses our gender. And it's not until we turn away from him that all of the pain and brokenness and misuse of all of that happens, right? So God is a loving Father, a wonderful designer. It's in his nature to give, but I think all too often we forget that he's the one who gave us a good starting point. And we've seen that the ways of the world don't work. But we've heard Jesus' promises. In Matthew 11:28, he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. You'll find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." I mean, how many of you feel weary and burdened by trying to navigate sexuality? Or just trying to navigate the voices on sexuality? And how many voices on sexuality can you listen to that are gentle and humble in heart and will give rest for your soul? That's rare. 1 John 5, John says, "This is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commands. In fact, this is love for God, to keep his commands." Listen to this. "His commands are not burdensome, for everyone born of God overcomes the world." So the pain of the world, God's trying to help us overcome this by giving us a new life. The question is, if we believe that we have made a mess of things and we believe that God has a good intention and gave us a good start and wants to heal us, what are God's commands? What's he trying to tell us? There's a lot of debate on this. There's a lot of people who are committed Christians who land in all sorts of different places on what does and does not qualify as sexual promiscuity, as lust, all of these things. And the difficult thing is, I'm not going to tell you exactly what to believe on this, but I want to take us back again to a few key things. First of all, in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul says, "Flee sexual immorality." Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? For you were bought at a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. So first of all, if we want to be believers and do things God's way, we need to have a commitment to, as we figure out what exactly is sexual immorality, to fleeing it. And then Romans 12, again, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Don't conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So my heart for the people in this room is that we would offer our bodies as living sacrifices to God, and that we would actually use our minds that God gave us to find out, God, what is your good, pleasing, and perfect will? And that we would trust that whatever God's will is, that it comes from a place of goodness and giving that he has. And I think when you do that, then that's when you'll actually do the difficult learning to get down to the answers of these debates. You know what I mean? We debate so much about, okay, a loving, monogamous, committed relationship between same-sex people, does that match the Old Testament? And a lot of times in these debates, my concern is less people's conclusions and more the number of people I talk to who make huge decisions sexually and with their lives without ever having read a book or prayed about it. And I'm like, there's a chance we'll land in different places on this, but do you actually want to offer your body as a living sacrifice and find out what God's will is? In terms of how we do that, I'd like to recommend a few resources to you that actually look at scriptures and what they say and what is and is not context. So here are a few books. Y'all can take a picture of this or come up to me afterwards. There are 2 books by Preston Sprinkle, absurd name of the day award, called People to be Loved and Embodied. Very academic, but accessible. And he looks verse by verse and Greek word by Greek word and Hebrew word by Hebrew word. Brandon and I have both been listening to an audiobook of that, and it's been very helpful. There's one called Love, Covenant, and Meaning by Jonathan Mills, where he challenges the notion that humans are sexual creatures by kind of pointing out, like, every animal is sexual. So that doesn't differentiate us. And then also, as we mentioned, not all humans are sexual. And he kind of comes down to this place of, no, humans are choosing creatures. We're different because we choose who we're going to be. And then finally, Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey, which looks at what does the church say about our bodies, what does the Bible say about our bodies, and how does Christianity actually have a more elevated view of the body than other belief systems. And then in terms of helping you develop a heart and an understanding for brothers and sisters who are LGBT, some books and resources that have been super helpful. One of them is called Washed and Waiting by Wesley Hill. It's a gay Christian man's story of just his experience navigating that. Another one is called Birds, Bees, and Me by Colin Bryce, who's a very sweet friend of mine. We go way back. And then the organization called Revoice, which is for Christians who are non-cisgender or non-heterosexual, who are just trying to follow what they believe is a traditional biblical sexual ethic. Finally, I would recommend The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman, which essentially is like the sexual revolution. You know how it's like, oh, the grandparents of that are Darwin and Nietzsche, and you're like, what are you even saying? Carl Trueman essentially looks at, like, how do we get to this place where we view ourselves as blank slates that we can just do whatever we want with. Fascinating book. It traces the stuff that happens in our culture today where your parents are like, where did this happen? Things didn't used to be this way. It traces it back hundreds of years and shows how this is a human issue and we've been going this way for a long time. I'm going to invite the worship team up. A few pastoral words on this. Again, main takeaway, offer your bodies up as living sacrifices and find out what God's will is. To people who come from a place where they're pretty relaxed in terms of sex and they don't think it's a big deal, I just want to remind you, my actions don't just affect me. My sins don't just affect me. So as you're figuring that out and figuring out what you'd believe, I would advise you to be very cautious. To those of you who are stuck in shame, in cycles of shame, I want to remind you that God can make anything new and that we're washed in the blood and that he loves you more than you know. And then to all of us, as we have discussions and read and learn and find ourselves disagreeing with each other, I want to remind you that Scripture says our war and our battle is against powers and principalities, not people, right? So the enemy is not the person you're sitting next to who disagrees with you. The enemy is the lie of the enemy, which is just really anything that's not God's will. So, I know that was a lot. I'm going to pray for us, and we will worship the God who gave us the bodies that we'll be using to worship him with. God, thank you so much for how good you are, and just allowing us to be in a community that's a safe place to figure out these things that are the source of so much confusion and shame. But I ask that you would help us to take a step back and see past our own pain and our own confusion and just see the gift that you've given us in our embodiment and in our sexuality. And that we would be able to offer ourselves up as sacrifices to you, trusting that you can make us new and that your Spirit will bring the peace and the joy that we seek. In your name I pray. Amen. I'm sweaty.